Lords and ladies, I greet you. We have about 2 weeks until the release of Baldur's Gate 3, and we're all sort of waiting here with bated breath, and there's not much we can do apart from theorize about various things, which is good for me in part because I like to speculate about the theory behind the story, but today I thought I'd make a video about something that's also speculative, but just as fun in its own right. That is, what Larian might possibly have in store in terms of DLC, expansions, etc., etc. And the way I'm going to approach this video is I'm going to start with the things that I believe are ultimately the most likely, and go down the list until we get to the things that are least likely or maybe even impossible. Now, historically, it's important to note that Larian, as a developer, has always released full, complete games, meaning there was nothing lacking in the story. You didn't need to add things to make the main story make sense. But they have on occasion released item packs and things that enhance the gameplay to varying degrees as concerned Divinity Original Sin 2, and I do think that history should be borne in mind. However, I also believe that Baldur's Gate 3 is something other dimensional when you compare it to Divinity Original Sin 2, which is a game I like. I don't love the game, I like it. And the scale and scope of Baldur's Gate 3 is just off the charts. So bearing both factors in mind, A, that Larian historically has not really released DLC or expansions of the sort that we've come to expect from many companies, but also, B, that Baldur's Gate 3 is something completely different, a completely different animal compared to all previous games they've made. It's worth speculating about this, and it might be fun. So let's begin with the most likely scenario, and that is simply patches that add things. Note, as I've mentioned several times and others have mentioned, that much of what Larian has produced in recent weeks when they were talking about classes or races was at launch. 11 playable races at launch. 12 playable classes at launch. This heavily implies that there's going to be more down the line. So in addition to the normal stuff that might be included in patches, such as performance enhancement in case there's some issues there, or some door you can't open in a building or whatever, I do think that with patches, certain things will be added. Potentially new races, new archetypes, maybe even new classes, such as the Artificer. I'd love to see that. So that is the most likely scenario. Now, less likely, but also possible, is that Larian will want to release paid DLC for some of these archetypes, classes, and things they might add to the game, items and so forth. In which case, I think most of us wouldn't have an issue with that. In the sense that if we really like Baldur's Gate 3, which I think most of us will, and we appreciate the effort Larian has put into the game, and we think that this could enhance the game, most of us, on principle, don't have anything against DLC as such. So let's say the Artificer class, as well as new items, and the addition of Azamar Lizard Folk, just as a random example, is a paid DLC and costs something like 10 euros. I think that would be fairly reasonable depending on how you look at it. So I do think new archetypes, perhaps new classes, as well as some new races and some new sub-races are in the pipeline. It's simply a question of, will these be part of normal patches, which I actually think is the most likely scenario given Larian's history, or will they arrive in the form of paid DLC, which I know a lot of people potentially might have an issue with, but personally I wouldn't, given the size and scope of the project. Now, we're about to enter much murkier territory, much less known territory, and that is the question of whether or not Larian would entertain the idea of paid expansions that are quite large in size and scope, because that's something they've never done before. I think this could happen, but it also could not happen. Now, personally, I would love it. I always like to reference The Witcher 3, in the sense that The Witcher 3 as such has a solid story, the main story, but with the addition of Hearts of Stone and Blood and Wine, these expansions, because that's what they weren't just DLCs, these expansions were just so much better, in my opinion, than the main story and the main quest, although the main story and quest was not bad per se, that they added so much to the game. They were great stories told, and they were, in many ways, especially Blood and Wine, games in their own right. Now, I would say, how cool would it be if Larian did something similar? Now, obviously, such expansions could not have too major an impact on the main story because the main story is complete. We know Larian, we know it's going to be a complete story with tons of details and tons of intertwining, interlocking plot points, but nonetheless a complete story. So it's unlikely an expansion would have something to do directly with the main story. But that doesn't mean they couldn't make a very nice expansion. We're talking about the Forgotten Realms here. There are many stories that could be told. So much lore, so many enemy types, so much magic, so many gods. There's just so much you could work with that if Larian said, look guys, we're working on a major expansion, a story expansion, that to boot raises the level cap to say 15 or 16, although I have absolutely no problem with the level cap in the main game being 12. After all, we're not necessarily trying to become gods, as far as we know, but something like a major expansion that raises the level cap to 16 or something like that. That includes some really, really cool stuff that is perhaps not completely epic, but moves in that direction. That might shed some light on various things in the main game and even complement it, but doesn't necessarily replace it or add things that should have been in the main story to begin with. Now again, if Larian said, look, we want to make this expansion, it's going to take a long time. They say they need 2 years to make it, and the expansion is so big that it costs me like 30 or 40 euros, but enhances the game. I'm all for that. New places to visit, new enemies, new items, new story. That would be absolutely fantastic in my humble opinion. Now, we are getting to the point of the least likely scenario, and that would be something like new companions, new origin characters. Now, I'm not entirely sure, but Fextra Life mentioned in one of his videos that there were probably 1 or 2 other companions that can join. These would presumably be normal companions in the sense that they're not infected with tadpoles as the origin characters are, but they can nonetheless join the party, presumably in Act 2, who knows. It would be pure speculation to even guess who these companions might be. Some people have guessed Alfira the Tiefling Bard in the Druid Grove, some people have guessed other people, but in any event, the least likely scenario, entirely new origin character, something very different, maybe one of the short folk, a gnome, a dwarf, or a halfling, with their own story, with their own issues, with their own struggles, fully integrated into the story. That would be amazing. And if they said it costs an extra 10 or 15 euros, I think that price point would be acceptable. The issue fundamentally, I think, with any of these ideas, even with the most basic ones I mentioned, the addition of new items, races, subraces, classes, and archetypes, is the question of reactivity. This has been a major point that Larian has highlighted on numerous occasions, that reactivity is a really big part of the game, meaning if you are a tiefling, you're going to get a reaction from that. If you're a gnome, you get a reaction from that. If you're a barbarian, you'll get a reaction from that. And on top of that, you'll get special interactions, as we know. In the very beginning of the Nautiloid ship, we know that as a barbarian, instead of using the key, you can actually tear open the pod to free Shadowheart. So this very pronounced reactivity could be ultimately the prohibitive factor in adding these types of things, adding expansions, etc., etc. And ironically, I think the thing that would be least prohibitive in this regard would be a completely new story-based expansion that has very little to do with the main story, but nonetheless is important and teaches you something about the lore and adds something to the overall game. Because in that case, you're not trying to add layers of reactivity upon the already present reactivity in the main game. You're just creating reactivity in expansion within something that's additional to that which already exists. So all in all, I really enjoy speculating about this. But of course, I'm intensely curious as to what you guys think. Again, I personally would have no issue paying for DLC. I think Larian's exception. If they decide to go down that route, I don't think they're betraying their principles necessarily, because it'd be very cool to get a lot of cool new stuff in a game like Baldur's Gate 3. That said, I think we're guaranteed to get something regarding new races, new items, new classes, new archetypes. As they said, at launch, we'll see how that works out. But ultimately, what I would love to see, the least likely scenarios, would be a very large story expansion independent of the main quest or the main story, as well as maybe an entirely new origin character that's just very different from the ones we have available now. Do you want DLC? Would you be okay with paying for it? Would you like a story expansion? Would you like another origin character you could play around with, someone who's very different? Let me know what you think in the comment section. And as always, thank you for checking out my video. If you'd like, you can join my Discord server. There are a lot of cool people there. We talk about Baldur's Gate 3 and other RPGs. And again, thank you for tuning in. And if you do the usual YouTube jazz of liking the video, sharing the video, commenting, subscribing, and hitting that bell icon so you can be informed of my videos, would be much appreciated. I'm trying to grow the channel. And thank you very much indeed again for tuning in. And I'll check you out next time. Take care.